The dress didn't fit the way it was supposed to. I stood in front of the narrow mirror in the corner of my room, the one with the chipped wooden frame that nobody had bothered to replace in years. And I pulled at the fabric along my waist, trying to smooth what couldn't be smoothed. The seamstress had measured me 3 weeks ago, back when the engagement hadn't felt real yet, back when the name Caius was still just a word people whispered, with their eyes wide and their voices low. Now the ceremony was tomorrow morning, and the dress was slightly too tight at the shoulders, and my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs and exhaled slowly. You are June Vale. You are 23 years old. You have survived worse than a tight dress. Outside my window, the Iron Vale pack ground stretched under a bruised evening sky, torches already lit along the stone path that led to the great hall, servants moving in clusters between the buildings, their breath rising in small clouds in the cold autumn air. The engagement banquet would begin in less than 2 hours. Delegates from 4 different packs had already arrived, advisors, elders, warriors who looked at me the same way they looked at furniture, present, functional, unremarkable. An Omega attending a formal engagement ceremony with the Alpha King of all packs was already unusual enough to make people uncomfortable. An Omega being the one engaged to him was the kind of thing that made grown wolves forget their manners entirely. I had learned, over the past 3 weeks, to keep my chin up and my expression neutral whenever I walked into a room. To pretend I didn't hear the murmurs that followed me through the corridors of Iron Vale Keep. To pretend I didn't notice the way Caius's senior beta, Rowan, always stood slightly too close to me in public spaces, not threatening exactly, but watchful in a way that reminded me constantly that I was being evaluated. What I hadn't yet learned was how to pretend that my stepsister wasn't here. Celine had arrived that afternoon. I hadn't been told she was coming. Nobody had thought to mention it. Or perhaps someone had decided deliberately not to warn me. She'd appeared in the courtyard with 2 trunks, and a smile so practiced it could have been painted on, her dark hair pinned up in a style that took at least an hour to achieve, her traveling cloak lined with fox fur that she definitely couldn't afford on her own. Someone had paid for her to come. I didn't know who yet, but I knew why. We had grown up in the same house, my father's house, before he passed, and then my stepmother's house, which felt like a different place entirely once the paperwork changed hands. Celine was 2 years older than me, and had spent most of those 2 years making sure I understood the precise distance between where she stood and where I stood. She was Beta-born. I was Omega. In our world, that gap was a canyon, and Celine had spent years decorating the edge of it, so I'd never forget how far the fall was. She hadn't been cruel in obvious ways. That was the thing people never understood when I tried to explain it. There were no dramatic confrontations, no screaming matches, no visible wounds. It was quieter than that. A word here, a well-timed comment there, a smile that arrived just slightly too late to be kind. June's so gentle, she used to say when people asked about me. She wouldn't last a day in a real pack. And everyone would nod, and nobody would argue, because she wasn't technically wrong. I was gentle. I wasn't built for dominance. And Iron Vale's world ran on power hierarchies that I had never been able to climb. Until 3 weeks ago, when Caius had looked at me across a crowded territorial meeting and said, in front of every alpha and elder present, that he had chosen me. I still didn't fully understand why. I turned away from the mirror and moved to the window, pressing 2 fingers lightly against the cold glass. Below, I could see the courtyard where Selene was now standing with a small group of delegates, laughing at something one of them said. Even from this height, I could read her posture. The slight lean forward, the tilt of her head, the way she gestured with both hands when she spoke. She was performing. She was always performing. She glanced up. I stepped back from the window before she could see me clearly, my heart doing something unpleasant in my chest. She came to ruin this. The thought arrived not as fear, but as certainty. The same quiet certainty I'd felt the night my father told me he was remarrying, the same certainty I'd felt the first time Selene looked at me and smiled that particular smile. I had learned to trust that instinct, because it had never once been wrong. I sat down on the edge of my bed and pressed my hands together, trying to think clearly. Caius didn't know Selene. He had never met her. To him, she would be simply a member of my family, a guest at his ceremony, someone to be welcomed with the formal courtesy he extended to everyone who entered his territory. He wouldn't know to watch her. He wouldn't know what that smile meant, or how to read the way she moved through a room like she was already measuring it for new furniture. But I knew. And the question was whether I should warn him. We were not close. Caius and I. The engagement had been arranged through channels I didn't fully understand, born out of political necessity and something else I couldn't name. And in the 3 weeks since it had been announced, we had spoken formally perhaps 6 times. He was not cold exactly, but he was contained. Every word he offered felt like something he had considered carefully before releasing it, and every silence between us felt weighted with things neither of us had said. He was also, undeniably, the most powerful wolf alive. Not just in title. Though the title of Alpha King carried weight that most people felt physically, a pressure in the air around him like the moment before a storm. It was something older than that. Something that lived in the way he stood, and the way the room reorganized itself around him whenever he walked in. Even wolves twice his age went quiet when he entered. Even the elders, who had known him since he was young, addressed him with a particular careful respect. I had been afraid of him, at first. I was less afraid now, which was perhaps its own kind of dangerous. A knock at my door pulled me back to the present. Miss Vale. It was Petra, one of the keep's attendants, a small woman with efficient hands and a voice that never wasted syllables. The Alpha King requests your presence in the East Corridor before the banquet. He says it's a brief matter. I smoothed my dress and reached for my cloak. Tell him I'll be there in a moment. The East Corridor was one of the quieter parts of the keep. A long stone hallway lined with tall windows that looked out over the back gardens, lit at this hour by the last gray threads of daylight and a row of iron wall sconces that cast warm, uneven light across the floor. I found Caius standing near the third window from the end, his back partially turned, studying something in the garden below. He was dressed for the banquet already, dark leather armor fitted with formal metalwork at the shoulders, his dark braided hair pulled back, the fur-lined cloak that marked his rank draped across his frame with the kind of effortless weight that suggested he'd worn versions of it his entire life. There was a thin scar near his jaw that I'd noticed before, and never commented on. His eyes, when he turned to look at me, were a pale, almost unsettling blue. June. He said my name the same way he said everything, with precision and without softness, but also without hardness, somewhere in between. You wanted to see me? Your stepsister arrived this afternoon. It wasn't a question. I kept my expression still. Yes. Unannounced. He turned fully toward me now, and I noticed what I always noticed when he was this close, that his attention, when it landed on you, felt total. Not invasive, just complete. Was she invited by your side of the arrangement? No, I said. She wasn't. Something moved behind his eyes, not surprise exactly. More like confirmation of something he'd already suspected. Do you know why she came? I considered lying, or softening it, or giving him the diplomatic version that would protect me from looking afraid or petty or small. Instead, I said, she came to make sure this doesn't happen. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 full seconds. Then Caius said very quietly, let her try. And something in the way he said it, not with anger, not with arrogance, but with an absolute and unhurried certainty, made the trembling in my hands finally stop. The banquet hall smelled like pine resin and roasted meat, and the particular kind of tension that only exists when powerful people are forced to share a room and pretend they aren't measuring each other. I walked in on Caius's left side, not quite beside him, not quite behind him, the position that had been explained to me as appropriate for the current stage of the arrangement by Rowan, who had delivered that information with the blank professionalism of someone reading from a document. The hall was full. Long tables draped in deep charcoal cloth, Candles burning in iron chandeliers overhead, the low murmur of conversation that paused, fractionally, every time Caius moved through the room. I felt the pauses like small stones dropped into still water. Ripple, ripple, ripple. The delegates from the Ashford pack were already seated. 3 of them, broad-shouldered men with the particular stillness of wolves who had learned to project calm as a form of dominance. Across the table, the Varen pack's representatives sat in a tight cluster, their beta female, a sharp-eyed woman named Dara, watching the room with the expression of someone keeping score. Near the far wall, a group of Ironvale's own senior warriors stood in loose formation, not quite relaxed, not quite at attention. The comfortable middle ground of people who belonged here and knew it. And near the center of the room, already holding a cup and already talking to someone I didn't recognize, was Celine. She had changed since the courtyard. Her gown was a deep burgundy that I knew, with the quiet precision of someone who had spent years cataloging her stepsister's wardrobe decisions she had brought specifically for tonight. It was beautiful. She was beautiful. I had never been able to deny that honestly, and I wasn't going to start now. Her dark hair was arranged in a way that managed to look both formal and effortless, and she was laughing at something her companion had said, her head tilted just so, her free hand resting lightly on the man's forearm. She looked, in other words, exactly like the kind of woman who should be standing next to an alpha king. I looked like a girl in a dress that was slightly too tight at the shoulders. Caius guided me toward the head table with a hand that didn't quite touch my back. Just present. Just close enough that the direction was clear. And I sat where I was supposed to sit, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. "She's watching you," said a voice to my right. I turned. Rowan had taken the seat beside me, something that hadn't been part of the original seating arrangement, I was fairly certain. He was perhaps 30, with a jaw that looked like it had been built for enduring things, and eyes that moved constantly around the room in the way of someone whose job was to notice what other people missed. He wasn't unfriendly. He was simply always, faintly, assessing. "I know," I said. "She's been asking questions since she arrived." He picked up his cup without looking at me. About the arrangement, about how it was decided, about whether there are formal grounds for a challenge. My stomach tightened. Is there a process for that? For challenging an engagement? "There's a process for everything in pack law." He paused. "Most of them haven't been used in decades. Some of them are flexible in how they're interpreted, depending on who's doing the interpreting. And who would be doing the interpreting if someone raised a challenge? The Elder Council." He finally looked at me. 3 of whom arrived this afternoon, coincidentally. I set my cup down very carefully. Across the room, Selene had shifted her attention, her companion forgotten, and was now speaking quietly to an older man with a silver-streaked beard and the deliberate posture of someone accustomed to sitting in judgment. I didn't recognize him specifically, but I recognized the type. I had grown up watching my stepmother work rooms exactly this way, identifying the person with the most structural power, positioning herself beside them, and then making everything that followed seem organic. Celine had learned from the same teacher. "What kind of challenge?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Rowan considered for a moment. An Omega claiming full mate bond rights with an Alpha King is historically unusual. There are those who would argue that without a demonstrated bond, the engagement is purely political, and political arrangements can be dissolved if a more suitable candidate presents herself and makes a formal petition before the bonding ceremony. Before tomorrow morning? Yes. I let that settle. The candlelight shifted as someone near the door moved, and the shadows across the table rearranged themselves briefly into something that looked, for just a moment, like the inside of my stepmother's house, the long dining table where I'd sat at the far end for years, the seat closest to the kitchen door, the seat that communicated without words exactly what I was worth in that household. I had left that table. I had left that house. And somehow the table had followed me here, all the way to Ironvale Keep, wearing a different cloth. "June." Caius's voice from my left. I turned. He was already seated at the head table, his posture the particular kind of straight that didn't come from effort, but from something built into the architecture of him. He wasn't looking at me with concern. Concern felt too soft a word for what lived in his expression. It was more deliberate than that. More like he was choosing, carefully, to direct his attention at me, and wanted me to understand that the choice was intentional. "Eat something," he said. "The next 2 hours will require your energy." It was not romantic. It was not tender. But it was direct. And it was said to me specifically, and in a room full of people who had spent the last hour deciding how little I mattered. It landed with a weight I hadn't expected. I reached for the bread. The first hour of the banquet passed without incident, or rather with the kind of incident that looks, from a distance, like nothing at all. Celine worked the room methodically. I tracked her without appearing to track her, which was a skill I had developed over years of living in the same house with someone who didn't like being watched. She spoke to the elder with the silver beard for nearly 20 minutes, long enough to establish something, not long enough to make it obvious. She spoke to 2 of the Ashford delegates. She spoke to a woman I didn't recognize who wore the insignia of a pack I couldn't place. Each conversation was brief, warm, and purposeful. She was building something. I just couldn't yet see the full shape of it. The shape became clearer when she finally made her way to the head table. She waited until Caius was engaged in conversation with the Veyron Beta female, a political discussion about border agreements that required his full attention. And then she appeared beside me like something that had simply materialized, her smile already in place, her cup held loosely in both hands. "June." She said my name the way she always said it, warmly, affectionately, like a word she owned. "Celine." I said hers the same way. I had practice. "You look lovely." She tilted her head, her gaze moving briefly over my dress. "The shoulders are a little, but still. It's a beautiful gown." There it was. Small enough to deny. Precise enough to land. "Thank you for coming," I said. It was unexpected. I couldn't miss this. Her voice carried the texture of something genuinely meant, which was the most dangerous register she had. "We're family, June. Whatever else has happened, I wanted to be here for you." For you. 2 words that could mean anything. "How long are you staying?" I asked. Through the ceremony, at least. She smiled. "I've been speaking with Elder Croft, the one with the silver beard. Do you know him? Wonderful man. Very knowledgeable about bonding traditions. He was explaining some of the historical protocols to me. Fascinating, really. How much weight pack law places on demonstrated compatibility between mates." She let the sentence sit there. "It does," I agreed, keeping my voice pleasant. "It also places a great deal of weight on the alpha's right to choose without requiring demonstration to anyone." Something shifted behind her eyes. Quick, small, but there. I saw it. I had been reading those shifts my entire life. "Of course," she said lightly. "I only meant, it must be reassuring for you to know those traditions exist. As a protection." She excused herself 2 minutes later, graceful and unhurried, and I sat with my hands folded in my lap and my breathing even and deliberate, and I thought very carefully about what she had just done. She hadn't threatened me. She had offered me a warning dressed as comfort, which was, in many ways, worse. It meant the threat was already in motion. It meant she had already spoken to Elder Croft. It meant that by tomorrow morning, there might be a formal petition sitting in front of the council with her name on it, and a legal argument underneath it that I didn't have the pack law knowledge to dismantle on my own. I needed to think. I turned slightly toward Caius. He was still in conversation, but something in his posture had shifted in the last few minutes. A fractional stillness that I was beginning to recognize as him paying attention to 2 things at once. He wasn't looking at me. But when I turned back to the table, there was a small, folded piece of paper near my plate that hadn't been there before. I opened it beneath the table, slowly. 4 words, in handwriting I didn't yet know by heart but was beginning to recognize. I heard all of it. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay on top of the covers in my room at Ironvale Keep, with my cloak still draped over the chair and the candle burning down to nothing on the bedside table. And I watched the ceiling and listened to the keep settle around me. The distant footsteps of the night patrol, the low moan of wind through the corridor gaps, the occasional creak of old stone adjusting to the cold. My mind kept returning to those 4 words. I heard all of it. I had spent the rest of the banquet trying to understand what they meant. Not the words themselves, which were plain enough, but the intention behind them. Was it reassurance? A warning to me that he was watching? A signal that he had already decided how to respond, and I didn't need to worry? Or something more complicated than any of those? Something that lived in the space between what Caius said and what he chose not to say, which was, I was learning. A very populated space. He had not spoken to me again privately that evening. The banquet had ended with formal toasts and the kind of ceremonial farewells that required everyone to perform ease they didn't feel. And then Rowan had appeared at my elbow and escorted me back to my room with the quiet efficiency of someone completing a task. And that had been that. The ceremony was at mid-morning. It was now, by my best estimate, somewhere around 3 in the morning. I sat up. The fire in the small hearth had burned low, and the room held a chill that had crept in from the window I'd left slightly open. I always slept better with cold air, a habit from years of living in a house where I'd had the smallest room, the one with the gap under the door that let the winter drafts in. At some point, the cold had stopped bothering me and started feeling like something I owned. I pulled on my boots and my cloak and did something I probably shouldn't have done. I went to find the library. Ironvale Keep's library was on the 2nd floor of the East Wing. I knew this because Petra had pointed it out during my first day here, in the brisk tour she'd given me of the spaces I was permitted to use freely. It was one of 3 rooms in that category. The others were my own chamber and the small walled garden off the south corridor, which was beautiful and completely exposed to the wind, and which I had visited exactly once. The library I had visited every day since arriving. It was a large room, longer than it was wide, with shelves built floor to ceiling along 3 walls, and a row of tall windows along the 4th that looked out over the dark grounds. At this hour, the windows were black mirrors. I could see my own reflection moving between the shelves, pale-haired and hollow-eyed, my cloak trailing behind me like something I hadn't fully committed to wearing. I was looking for Pack law records. Specifically, anything related to the protocols Celine had mentioned. The ones Elder Croft had apparently been explaining to her with such warmth and detail. It took me 20 minutes of searching before I found the right shelf, a row of older volumes, their spines worn and their titles stamped in faded gold, organized by date rather than subject, in the way of archives that have never been reorganized, because nobody thought they'd need to be consulted. I pulled the most recent formal compilation, Ironvale Pack Law, Consolidated Traditions and Binding Protocols, revised edition, and carried it to the table nearest the window, and sat down and began to read. The relevant section was not hard to find. It was, in fact, marked, not by me, and not recently. Someone had placed a thin strip of leather between the pages at the chapter titled Formal Challenges to Bonding Arrangements, and when I opened to it, I found that several passages had been underlined in pencil, carefully, in handwriting I recognized immediately. It was Caius's handwriting, the same as the note. I sat very still for a moment. Then I read. The law was older than I'd expected. Centuries old in its original form, though the language had been updated in the revision. It stated that a formal challenge to an Alpha's chosen mate could be submitted to the Elder Council by any Pack member of Beta rank or above, provided the challenge was filed before the bonding ceremony and included a documented claim of superior compatibility. The Council was then required to convene a formal hearing, during which both the challenger and the chosen mate would present their cases, and the Council would issue a binding recommendation. The recommendation was not, technically, enforceable. The Alpha King retained final authority. But there was a footnote, long, dense, written in the careful language of someone who had spent considerable time constructing a legal argument in the guise of a clarification. It stated that while the Alpha King retained final authority, a council recommendation issued by unanimous vote carried significant social and political weight, and that historically, Alpha Kings who had proceeded against unanimous council recommendations had faced, the footnote used the word complications, in the consolidation of their authority in the months following the ceremony. Complications. A beautifully neutral word for what I suspected it actually meant. Selene didn't need to stop the ceremony outright. She just needed to create enough institutional doubt to make the morning difficult. To make Caius's position uncomfortable. To introduce, into the formal record of his reign, a moment of hesitation. It was clever. It was exactly the kind of move that left no fingerprints. You read quickly. I didn't drop the book, but it was a near thing. Caius was standing in the doorway of the library, still dressed. Not in his formal armor from the banquet, but in something simpler, dark linen and leather, his braids slightly looser than they'd been earlier, like he'd partially undone them and then stopped. He looked, in the low lamplight of the library, less like an Alpha King, and more like a man who also hadn't slept. I couldn't rest, I said. Neither could I. He walked into the room without hurrying, his footsteps quiet on the stone floor, and stopped at the near edge of the table. He looked at the open book without expression. You found the section. You marked it. 3 days ago. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. Not formally, not with the contained posture he carried in public spaces, but with the careful ease of someone who had decided, in this specific room, at this specific hour, to set something down. When I learned she was coming, I looked at him. You knew 3 days ago? My intelligence network is adequate. He said it without arrogance, just fact. I knew she had purchased travel arrangements. I knew she had made contact with Elder Croft. I knew the nature of the challenge she intended to file. A pause. I wanted to see how you would respond. Something in my chest went very quiet. You were testing me, I said. I was learning you. He held my gaze. There's a difference. I thought about that for a moment. The distinction between a test and an observation, between judgment and understanding. They felt similar from the inside, but perhaps from the outside they looked different. Perhaps one of them came from a place of doubt, and the other from something more like interest. What did you learn? I asked. That you don't panic. He rested one forearm on the table, his posture open in a way I hadn't seen in any public context. That you track a room. That when someone moves against you, your first instinct is to understand the mechanism before you react to it. He paused. That you came here at 3 a.m. to read pack law instead of waking someone up and asking them to fix it for you. I looked down at the book. Can you fix it? Yes. How? The challenge requires Elder Council convening. I can decline to convene them. He said it simply. As Alpha King, I have the authority to table any council matter until after a bonding ceremony is complete. Once the ceremony is done, the challenge has no legal standing. A bonding cannot be challenged retroactively under any current provision of pack law. Then why hasn't she been stopped already? Because I wanted the morning to proceed cleanly. Something moved in his expression. Something that I still didn't have the vocabulary for, but that I was beginning to build a language around, piece by piece. And because I wanted to have this conversation, the fire in the hearth across the room had burned to coals. Outside the tall windows, the grounds of Ironvale were dark and still, and the sky above the tree line was beginning, just barely, at the very edge, to lighten toward the gray that comes before dawn. What conversation? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had shifted. Not softer, exactly, but less guarded, less constructed. You've been in this keep for 3 weeks, he said, and in that time you have not asked me for a single thing, not reassurance, not explanation, not protection. He paused. Most people in your position would have asked for all 3 before the first week was out. I didn't want to assume you owed me those things. I don't. His eyes stayed on mine. But I'm offering them anyway. There's a difference there, too. The pre-dawn gray was spreading now, slow and inevitable, the way light always came. Not all at once, but incrementally, filling the spaces between dark things until the dark things were simply shapes again, ordinary and manageable. I had spent a long time living in a house where I'd learned not to ask for things. Not because asking was forbidden exactly, but because the cost of asking and being denied was always higher than the cost of simply going without. I had built a whole interior architecture around that lesson. Walls and corridors and quietly locked doors. Caius was sitting across from me in a library at 4 a.m, telling me the doors could open. I wasn't sure yet whether to believe him, but I was, for the first time in a very long time, considering it. The ceremony is in 6 hours, I said. Yes. And Celine will file the challenge first thing in the morning, before it begins. She'll try. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. Let her. Outside, somewhere on the grounds, a bird called once into the pre-dawn quiet, and then went still. I closed the book. Morning arrived the way difficult things often do. Not with drama, but with a slow, gray inevitability that left no room for pretending it wasn't happening. I dressed without Petra's help. She had offered, appearing at my door at first light with her efficient hands and her economy of words. But I had thanked her and asked for an hour alone, and she had nodded once and left without commentary, which was one of the things I had come to appreciate about her. Some people, when you asked for space, filled it with the noise of their departure. Petra simply left. I stood at the mirror again, the same narrow one with the chipped frame, and I braided my blonde hair myself, slowly, the way I had learned to do it as a child when there was nobody to help. The dress was the same one from the night before, because the engagement ceremony didn't require a change of gown, only the formal cloak that would be clasped at the ceremony itself, a deep charcoal gray that Rowan had delivered to my room the previous evening, with a note explaining that it had been made to Iron Vale's specifications. I clasped it at my throat and looked at my reflection. I looked like someone about to walk into something, which was, I supposed, accurate. The corridor outside my room was already busy when I opened the door. Servants moving with purpose, a cluster of warriors in formal dress near the staircase, 2 of the Ashford delegates speaking quietly near the window at the end of the hall. The morning had the particular quality of a place preparing for ceremony. Everything slightly heightened, the air carrying the faint smell of candle smoke, and something herbal that I suspected was burned as part of the formal ritual. Rowan was waiting for me at the top of the stairs. He fell into step beside me without preamble. She filed it. I had expected this. I had lain awake through the last gray hours of pre-dawn expecting exactly this. And still, hearing it stated plainly made something in my stomach contract. When? An hour ago, Elder Croft received it personally. He kept his voice low, his eyes forward as we walked. Formal petition, correctly formatted, citing the compatibility protocols under Chapter 9 of the Consolidated Law. She had help preparing it. The language is too clean for someone who only arrived yesterday. She brought it with her, I said. She prepared it before she came. Rowan nodded, almost imperceptibly. Elder Croft has called an informal gathering of the 3 elders present. They're meeting in the East Anteroom. A pause. They've sent word requesting the Alpha King's attendance. And? He declined. Rowan glanced at me briefly. He sent a written response instead. 2 sentences. I waited. The first sentence invoked his authority to table the matter until after the ceremony. The second sentence reminded the council that under pack law, an Alpha King's formal engagement cannot be administratively interrupted within 6 hours of the scheduled ceremony without his explicit consent. Another pause. He did not give his explicit consent. I exhaled slowly. That should be the end of it. Legally, yes. Rowan stopped walking. We were at the top of the main staircase now, and below us the entrance hall was full of people moving toward the ceremonial courtyard. Delegates, Warriors, pack members, all filtering through the wide front doors into the cold morning air. But Celine has requested the right to speak publicly before the ceremony begins. She's invoking an older tradition, the right of any pack member to address the gathered assembly before a formal bonding. It's rarely used. It can't be legally blocked. I looked at him. She's going to do it in front of everyone. Yes. The legal architecture had failed. So she'd moved to the social one, which was, I realized, exactly what I would have expected from her. The formal challenge was never the primary weapon. It was the setup. The public address was the blade. She was going to stand in front of every delegate, every elder, every warrior present, and say whatever she had prepared to say, and she was going to say it to a crowd that was already uncertain about me, already quietly skeptical of an Omega standing beside an Alpha King, already primed to receive doubt. "What time does the ceremony begin?" I asked. 1 hour. I started down the stairs. The ceremonial courtyard of Ironvale Keep was a wide stone space enclosed on 3 sides by the keep's walls, and open on the 4th to the eastern grounds, where the old ash trees stood in a row that must have been planted centuries ago. They were enormous, their bare autumn branches interlocked overhead, like the arches of a cathedral. Stone benches had been arranged in a semicircle, facing the ceremonial platform, and every bench was occupied. The air smelled like wood smoke and frost, and the particular sharpness of a cold, clear morning. I found my place, to the left of the platform, where I was meant to wait until the formal procession. And I stood with my hands folded, and my breathing deliberate, and I watched the crowd settle. Celine was already there. She was standing near the front, in the space between the benches and the platform, and she was speaking to Elder Croft again. Quietly, her head bent slightly toward him, her expression carrying that particular quality of earnest concern that she deployed with such precision. The elder was listening with his hands clasped behind his back, and his expression professionally neutral, which told me nothing about which way he was leaning. Around them, people were noticing. The shift in attention was subtle but unmistakable. The slight reorientation of postures, the quiet conversations that paused and then resumed at a lower register. Celine had positioned herself so that anyone looking toward the platform would also see her. It was, as always, a matter of geometry. Rowan materialized beside me. She's going to speak first, before the processional. I know. I watched her for another moment. Let her. He looked at me sideways. You have a plan. I have something, I said. I'm not sure it qualifies as a plan. What I had was this. 3 weeks of watching Caius. 3 weeks of learning how he moved through rooms, how he chose his words, how he held his silences. 3 weeks of understanding that he was not a man who reacted. He was a man who had already considered every possibility before the moment arrived, and had simply chosen which one to enact. And I had a library conversation at 4 a.m. that I had turned over and over in my mind, until I thought I understood what it had actually been. Not a test. Not even, entirely, a reassurance. An alignment. 2 people sitting across from each other in the quiet hours before a difficult morning and choosing, without using those exact words, to face it from the same direction. The crowd settled. Elder Croft stepped forward, and the quiet deepened. Before the formal ceremony begins, the elder said, his voice carrying the practiced projection of someone accustomed to addressing assemblies. A formal request has been made to address the gathered pack under the tradition of open voice. This tradition grants any pack member the right to speak before a bonding, that the community may bear witness. He paused. Celine of the Vale household has invoked this right. The murmur that moved through the crowd was brief and complicated. Celine stepped forward. She was composed. She was always composed when it mattered. That was perhaps the thing I most genuinely respected about her, even now. Even standing in this courtyard watching her prepare to dismantle my future with the careful precision of someone who had practiced this speech 100 times. She stood in front of that crowd and she looked like she belonged there. And I felt, for just a moment, the old familiar vertigo of comparison. The canyon between Beta and Omega, between her and me, between who was visibly, unmistakably meant for this world and who was only passing through it. And then the vertigo passed, because I had sat in a library at 4 a.m, and a man who could silence rooms with his presence had told me he was paying attention. "I come forward not in opposition," Celine began, her voice warm and carrying just the right note of reluctant concern. "But out of love for my stepsister and respect for this pack and its traditions. June is gentle, she is kind. I say this with genuine affection." She paused, and the pause was perfectly weighted. "But kindness is not the same as strength. And I have to ask, not as a challenger, but as family, whether this union serves June as well as it serves the political needs it was built around. Whether she was given a true choice. Whether she was given every choice." Caius's voice. He had appeared. I hadn't seen him come out, hadn't seen the moment he stepped onto the platform. But he was there now, and the effect of his voice in that courtyard was exactly what it always was. The air reorganized itself. Every head turned. Every conversation ended. He stood on the platform in his formal armor, his cloak catching the morning wind, and he was looking directly at Celine with the expression I had come to understand meant he had already considered this moment from every angle and had chosen, deliberately, what to do with it. June Vielle accepted this arrangement after 3 private conversations in which I explained in full what it would require of her, he said. His voice was even and unhurried, and filled the courtyard without effort. She asked questions I did not expect. She took 2 days to consider her answer. She said yes without conditions. He paused. There was no absence of choice. Celine opened her mouth. Additionally, Caius continued, with the quiet finality of someone who has not finished. June spent last night, while her stepsister slept, reading pack law by herself in the library, at 4 a.m, in order to understand the mechanism of this challenge and address it on her own terms. Something in his expression shifted, barely, but I saw it. That is not a woman who requires protection from her own decisions. The silence that followed was total. Celine stood very still. For the first time in my memory, she had nothing ready. And in that silence, with the morning light falling cold and clear across the courtyard and the ash trees standing overhead like witnesses, I felt the old architecture inside me, all those carefully constructed walls and locked corridors, begin, very quietly, to change. Not collapse, not disappear, just open. The ceremony was quiet, not in the way that quiet means empty, but in the way that quiet means full of something that doesn't need words. The elder who performed the formal rite had a low, steady voice, and the words he spoke were old ones, worn smooth by centuries of use, and they fell across the courtyard like stones settling into still water. I stood on the platform beside Caius, and I listened to every syllable, and I tried to hold on to the feeling of the morning air on my face, cold and clean and absolutely real, because I wanted to remember this specific moment with my whole body, not just my mind. Celine had not left the courtyard. I had expected her to. I had anticipated, in the seconds after Caius spoke, that she would find the dignified exit, a quiet withdrawal, a composed departure that would let her carry the morning's defeat with the same practiced grace she carried everything else. Instead, she had moved to one of the outer benches and sat down, and she had watched the ceremony from there, with an expression I couldn't fully read from the platform. Not anger, not humiliation, exactly. Something more complicated and more human than either of those. I did not look at her often, but when I did, I tried to look without the years between us. It was harder than it should have been, but I tried. When the elder finished the final passage, and the formal declaration was made, witnessed by 3 elders, 2 pack betas, and every delegate present, Caius turned to me, and I turned to him, and for a moment neither of us spoke. His pale eyes held that same total quality of attention that I had noticed the very first time we'd stood this close. that feeling of being seen completely and without flinching. "Well," he said quietly, "just to me." The word was dry and understated, and carried in it the ghost of something that might, in different circumstances, have been a smile. "Well," I agreed. And that was the whole of it. No grand declaration, no theatrical moment. Just two people standing in a cold courtyard on an autumn morning, having arrived at something together. The afternoon that followed the ceremony was long and full of the formal obligations that come after public events, the receiving of delegates, the exchange of diplomatic courtesies, the careful navigation of conversations that were really negotiations in softer clothing. Caius moved through it all with the contained fluency of someone who had been doing this since before he could fully understand what it meant, and I moved through it beside him, and paid attention, and learned. Dara, the sharp-eyed beta female from the Veyron pack, sought me out specifically during the post-ceremony gathering. She was perhaps 40, with close-cropped gray hair, and the direct gaze of someone who had decided long ago that indirectness was a waste of everyone's time. "I watched you during the Ashford negotiations last week," she said, without preamble. "You were sitting in the back of the room. You weren't supposed to be part of the discussion." "I wasn't," I agreed. "You were taking notes." "I was." She studied me for a moment. "The point you made afterward, to Rowan, in the corridor, about the Ashford Pack's water rights claim. He brought it to Caius, and Caius used it in the second session." She paused. "Nobody told you that." "I figured it probably went somewhere." Dara looked at me with an expression that landed somewhere between assessment and satisfaction. "The Veyron Pack has been waiting for an Omega in Iron Vale's inner circle for a generation," she said. "We have theories about why it matters. I suspect you'll develop your own." She inclined her head, a formal gesture, more deliberate than a nod. "Congratulations, June." She moved away before I could respond, which I suspected was intentional. I stood with that for a moment, the word congratulations carrying more weight than it usually did, landing not as a social pleasantry, but as something that felt, from Dara specifically, like a statement of position. Rowan appeared at my elbow. What did she want? To say congratulations. He made a sound that was not quite skeptical. "Dara doesn't cross a room to say congratulations." "No," I agreed. "She doesn't." He looked at me for a moment, then away. "You're going to be difficult to manage, aren't you?" "I'm going to be very easy to manage," I said, "as long as managing me means letting me read things and sit in the back of rooms." He made the sound again, but this time there was something different underneath it, something that might, with time, become the foundation of something like trust. I found Celine in the walled garden off the south corridor that evening. I hadn't planned to. I had been walking, needing the cold air and the open space after hours of indoor ceremony and formal conversation, and I had rounded the corner into the garden, and there she was, sitting on the stone bench nearest the dormant rose hedge, her burgundy gown exchanged for a traveling cloak, her hair no longer pinned but loose around her shoulders. She looked up when she heard my footsteps. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she said, "I'm leaving tomorrow morning." "I know. I had heard as much from Petra. Your trunks are being prepared." She looked down at her hands. In the fading evening light, without the performance and without the careful social architecture she always erected around herself, she looked different. Not smaller, exactly, but more present. More like the version of her I had occasionally glimpsed late at night in our shared childhood house, the version that existed in the spaces between the performance. "I prepared that challenge for 3 weeks," she said. Her voice was quiet and factual, the way people speak when they've moved past the point where pretending costs anything. "I contacted Elder Croft 2 weeks before I arrived. I had the petition drafted by a pack law specialist in the Ashford territory." A pause. I was thorough. "You were," I said. "You always are." She looked up at me. "And it didn't matter." "No." She was quiet for a moment. The garden smelled like cold earth and the faint remnant of summer herbs, and somewhere beyond the wall an owl called twice and went silent. He spoke about you, she said finally, in a way I didn't expect. I waited. I've attended 3 bonding ceremonies in my life. I've watched alphas say the required words about their chosen mates, and I've watched it mean the required amount, nothing more. She looked at her hands again. He wasn't saying the required amount. I didn't respond to that, not because I disagreed, but because some things don't need a response. They just need to be acknowledged, quietly, in the space between people who have known each other for a long time. I've been doing this for years, she said. Since your father passed, since the house became what it became. I've been building positions, making moves, managing outcomes. She exhaled. I don't entirely know how to stop. I know, I said. And I did. I understood, in the way you can only understand something by having grown up inside it, that Celine's particular form of ambition had not been born from cruelty. It had been born from the same insecurity that had shaped me. The same house, the same hierarchy, the same constant subterranean message that you had to position yourself correctly, or be consumed by the positioning of others. We had just responded to it differently. I had learned to make myself smaller. She had learned to make herself larger. Neither of us had come out of it undamaged. I'm not going to apologize, she said. I don't think apologies mean anything when the action was that deliberate. No, I agreed. They don't. But She stopped. Started again. I hope it's real. What he spoke about. I hope it's actually what it sounded like. I looked at her for a long moment. My stepsister, sitting on a stone bench in a cold garden in a keep that would never be hers. Her careful hair loose around her shoulders, saying the closest thing to a genuine thing I had ever heard her say. So do I said. She nodded. She rose from the bench, pulling her cloak tighter. She paused when she was level with me on the path. You were always smarter than I let you be, she said quietly. And then she walked past me and through the garden gate and back into the keep, and I stood in the cold and listened to her footsteps fade. Celine left the following morning before most of the keep was awake. I watched from my window, our window briefly, the one that looked over the courtyard, as her trunks were loaded and her transport pulled away through the stone gates in the early gray light. She did not look up. I didn't know if we would see each other again. I didn't know what the next year would look like, or the year after that, whether I would find my footing in Iron Vale's inner workings, whether Dara's theories about Omegas in positions of influence would prove to mean something, whether Rowan would eventually stop standing slightly too close in public spaces as a precaution. I didn't know any of it, but I had learned, in the past 3 days, that not knowing was different from being unprepared. 3 months later, I sat at the long table in Iron Vale's council chamber, not at the back, not as an observer, but at the table itself, with documents in front of me, and a role that had been given a formal title 6 weeks after the ceremony. When Caius had walked into the library one evening and set a written appointment in front of me and said simply, "The pack needs someone who reads things at 4 a.m. I've decided it should be official." The council chamber smelled like old wood and ink, and the particular kind of purposefulness that comes from work that matters. Around the table sat Rowan and Dara, who had formally requested a standing seat in Iron Vale's advisory council and been granted it, and 2 of the Iron Vale senior wolves whose names I now knew well, whose histories I had read, whose children I had met at the pack gathering the previous month. Caius sat at the head of the table. He caught my eye across the room, briefly, with that same quality of deliberate attention, and something in his expression carried what I had come to understand, over 3 months of learning a new language, was the particular form of warmth he reserved for private moments. Not softness. Something more durable than softness. Something that had been chosen, carefully, and then chosen again every day since. I turned back to my documents. Outside the council chamber windows, the Iron Vale grounds were covered in the first thin snow of winter, white and clean and unmarked, the way beginnings always look before you step into them. I had been invisible for a long time. I was not invisible anymore. and the girl who had stood in front of a chipped mirror and pulled at a dress that didn't fit. She was still in me somewhere, still present, still part of the architecture. But she was no longer the whole of it. I had built new rooms, and I intended to fill them.